All right, everybody, it's about 11 o'clock West Coast time, 1 o'clock Central. I'm Patrick Woolnett. I am the Teaching and Research Librarian at Linfield College. I am also the chair of the Discussion Group Steering Committee for ACRL's Instruction section. And I'd like to take a second to welcome you to our annual virtual discussion forum. This is an offering that we make available every year around ALA Annual. This year it's a little different. So in previous years we've had a face-to-face forum at the conference, but last year the instruction section made the decision to go to all virtual meetings. So this is the first time we've done a virtual forum around annual, and it's also the first time, to my knowledge, that we've offered a panel discussion. So we're very excited about that. And speaking of panel discussions, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. Our moderators are Hannah Gasho-Rempel and Anne-Marie Dietering from Oregon State University. And our panelists are Anne Jumonville-Graf, Rosemary Green, and Stephanie Otis. Anne Graf is from Trinity University, Rosemary is from Shenandoah University, and Stephanie's from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And the topic of our panel today is Critical Reading for Learning and Social Change, a panel discussion. At the end of the panel today, there'll be an evaluation form that we would love it if you would please fill out. It will help us to plan future events, both around midwinter and at annual. And you will probably notice that if you are an attendee, then your mic is muted currently. However, you can still participate. The panelists will be taking your questions throughout the course of the panel, so please use the chat form or the chat forum to ask those questions. They will be paying attention to them. And without further ado, I'm gonna hand the reins over to Hannah. So take it away, Hannah.
All right, thanks, Patrick. So it's very fun to watch all of you coming in and seeing all the places around the world that the participants are from. And the panelists too are joining us from across the United States. So we here, teaching librarians, are heavily invested in helping our learners find sources. But of course, we also want learners to make sense of those sources that we work so hard to make available and help people find. And to do that, we need to engage our learners in the skills of critical reading. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And one of the things I think is really great about our three panelists is that they come at this question from three different but also overlapping ways. So you'll hear about strategies for developing critical reading skills that are scaffolded across a term-long project, as well as some ideas for one-shots. You'll hear about ways to work with undergraduates as well as graduate students, and you'll hear about ideas for working with campus stakeholders who are interested in developing these critical reading abilities. So as Patrick mentioned, feel free to ask questions using the chat throughout. My colleague who's lurking here on the side, Anne-Marie, will be there the whole time to help moderate that. I do have a list of questions, so if we see that one of them's coming up, we'll just maybe wait a second for that, but ask questions throughout, we'll pause some, and we'll definitely leave space at the end for your questions. So because the idea of critical reading might be new for some of us, that's where we're going to start today. So I'm going to ask the panelists to each share their definition of critical reading, especially in the context of the learner population that they work with. So take it away. Maybe Rosemary wants to kick us off.
Okay, well, speaking of special populations, I work pretty exclusively with graduate students, and I do teach a semester-long credit-bearing course that involves a lot of intensive reading and writing. And so right off the bat, I ask students, what does it mean to read academically? And I ask them to reflect on what the act of reading academically means. And they do this in a reflective journal. And the responses that I get most often are reading with purpose, connecting to what one already knows, and reading in order to reflect. So that's kind of a broad, it's not a pat definition. I don't have a pat definition of reading critically, but those are the components as I see it working with graduate students.
Thanks. Maybe Stephanie, you could share with us next.
Sure. So my work has mostly been with undergraduate students, starting with sophomores to seniors in global studies. And so what we were looking at with them in defining critical reading was reading as researchers. So not just to repeat a source or accept it as unchallenged truth, but to be able to use and synthesize those sources. So reading not just for content, but for rhetorical strategies, disciplinary and genre conventions, and like Rosemary said, for making connections either to the text from prior knowledge, with other readings and other sources, joining the scholarly conversation with the authors of those sources, and also looking for and raising new questions.
Very helpful. So Anne, how do you think about critical reading?
So it's interesting, we've gone graduate to sort of sophomore to senior, and I work primarily with first-year students, although I also teach at other levels, but I find that I define critical reading for them by really just starting at the point of talking about having them think about themselves as readers, as a person who reads, and as a text as something written by a writer, to sort of return the person and the people into it and take it out of sort of the context of this is a task that you were assigned for a test. And from there, if we can go from you are a person who reads and can choose to read in different ways, you can read a person's writing that was written for different kinds of purposes, then we can also at least begin to talk about the context in which you read and the context in which people write.
Very helpful. And I too, I thought about the progression from starting from graduate students, but coming down to where many of us share a common audience of those first-year students. So in thinking about critical reading, do you have assumptions that either you brought when you were first considering this topic, or as you've thought about critical reading that you've recognized that others around you, maybe librarians or faculty you work with, assumptions they have about critical reading? And Anne, I'll let you go first on this one.
Yeah, I think that I thought of reading, I'll just speak for myself as a librarian. So an assumption I had is that initially that reading is something that happened in the classroom, and that in the library what I taught was evaluation. And I really thought of those as different skills, and it wasn't until I worked more closely with faculty in the English department, and also until I was teaching my own course, that I saw that that was really kind of a disservice to students and maybe confusing for them to think of those things differently. So that was an assumption I had, that what librarians do is evaluation, and what happens in like an English classroom is reading.
So Rosemary or Stephanie, I'll let you choose who wants to jump in. What assumptions do you have?
I'll speak quickly about what is actually a named phenomenon. You may be familiar with it. It's the assumption of prior knowledge. So you can find evidence in the literature that individuals, faculty, librarians, other people in a learning community assume that when students are accepted into advanced studies, when they become graduate students, either master's or doctoral, the assumption is that they are already critical, competent, proficient, and quick readers. And I think that's a faulty assumption. At least I've learned that from talking with and being with students.
And I'll just agree with both Anne and Rosemary that I think there's an assumption that students are able to do this, that they don't need our support and they don't need the practice and the time in class to work on these skills. And also that the assumption that what they need the most help from librarians with is finding the sources. But I think the more we help them figure out how to read these sources, the better they're able to find the ones that are going to be most useful and engaging for them in their research.
So you talked a little bit in your definition, each of you did, of who your learners were. So can you expand a little bit now and talk about what your reading goals are for your learners?
I can start. So when I kind of have two different sets of goals. When I teach a class, when I'm the instructor of record for a full semester class, my critical reading goals for my students are to be able to read for what the text is saying, how it's saying it, why it's saying it, and sort of what's the larger impact. As a librarian, I don't often have sort of the space or the room to really do as much of that. So my goal there is actually just to sort of connect reading to the kinds of things we do in a library classroom. So, you know, we don't often think of reading a results page as a kind of reading, but it is, or, you know, reading a database record. Or so I kind of ask them to think about things that might have become sort of automatic or rote as opportunities to, you know, look more clearly or deeply at a page.
That's a really interesting approach. Stephanie, your learner goals.
So I mentioned a few of these in my definition. So I want them to be able to make connections, to feel like they're joining a conversation, to ask questions, and to respond rather than to either just regurgitate information or to react. So one thing we talk about is having students refer back to the text when they're explaining what it means or what it accomplishes, versus just off the top of their heads, which is often going to be more of an emotional reaction. So always referring back to the text. And getting away from a checklist approach to evaluating and choosing resources is a goal. So really looking at context and those connections and where a particular text or source fits in the body of literature about a topic or the conversation around it.
And I can echo just about everything that Anne and Stephanie just said. My biggest goal is to shine a light on the importance of reading. That's really where I start, particularly with graduate students. Because they may not come into their graduate programs really thinking about the connection with reading in so many of the other literacies that are swirling around us. So I really try to get them to think about reading, to pay attention to themselves as readers. We talk about metacognitive awareness, and so one of my goals is to have them investigate themselves as readers, to be conscious of themselves as readers, and to see how their reading practices and experiences may change over time. So that's probably the overarching principle that drives most of my instruction.
So let's get a little more concrete. I think that's a great jumping off point, Rosemary. So can you describe an activity that you use to engage learners in critical reading?
Sure. Because I have the luxury of a semester-long course, I introduce scaffolded activities. And one of the first activities is for them to read, of their own selection, to read preferably an article or a book chapter or perhaps a chapter from a dissertation, something scholarly. And then I ask them to write an abstract. And I realize that in most cases they've seen the author's abstract, and that's just fine. But I ask them to cover it up and to write an abstract using some guiding questions. So I ask them to consider what the study or what the piece is about, why it was written in the first place, how the study was conducted, and basically, so what? Why should I care? Or why should any of us care? The guiding questions help them a lot. And although this is something that I use with graduate students, it could work with undergraduates as well, because they could be given, say, the results section, and they could be asked to pick that section apart and act as if they are going to write an abstract, because that would be 2 or 3 sentences in an abstract. So that's an activity that works pretty well, and then it builds on everything else.
Nice. So I'm going to jump to Anne, because I know that you also have some interesting activities, particularly in the one-shot, but not just in the one-shot.
Yeah, so the one-shot that I work with a lot is doing sessions for English classes, and I was kind of dissatisfied with the way that I was talking about how to evaluate sources. And I was dissatisfied with it because it didn't seem connected to how the professors were talking about, secondary scholarship in literature. They kind of seem sort of perplexed that you would make any kind of judgment about a piece before reading it, which is honestly a lot of times what we're doing when we're teaching sort of source evaluation. So I really wanted to kind of bridge that gap. So my new thing that I've been doing for several semesters now, so I guess it's not new, is I give students, all the students in the class, a citation, and they have to find it in full text, which also allows me to vastly shorten some of the finding pieces, because I just walk around and see how they're doing that. Once they've all got it up in full text, I tell them, okay, we are going to have a vote as a class on the quality and appropriateness of this piece for the kind of assignment you would be doing in this class. And I just have them do it. You could fancy it up with like poll everywhere or something, but we just do like raise your hand, 1, 2, 3, or 4, 4 being very high quality, 1 being low. And I tell them the purpose of this is not really the vote, but to be able to explain and justify your choice. I also tell them they're only going to have a few minutes to do this. And so part of what this is, the way that I think about it, is it's kind of an awakening to critical reading, where once they vote, and there's inevitably a range of opinions, there's some easy low-hanging fruit that we can kind of get out of the way, like, oh, it was short, or, oh, the author wrote these other articles or something. And then we can kind of move into like, well, but what else would you need to know to really talk about this piece, whether it's well constructed, whether the argument is sound, like how relevant it is. And they usually initiate those things. They say, well, how can I really evaluate it without going into this or reading this other piece that they've cited? So they really, I think, ask themselves the questions that we hope that they will ask in their reading. So the activity is kind of a precursor activity. We don't actually do all those steps, but we elicit sort of the steps that are needed in critical reading. And I also have the professor participate, and that's usually a pretty good way to surface some of their own desires in terms of the kind of sources students use and how they would approach a source as a scholar. And that can be helpful if there are things that they may not have told students about what they want them to be doing. So it kind of is like a many birds with one stone activity that has worked well for me.
So I'm going to just insert here a question from the chat from Barbara Valentine. Go Oregonians. She wonders how long that takes.
Yeah, so in the class that I do it with, we actually do like 3 of these citations, so we can do different kinds of quality. And if we do 3, it takes a long time. It takes 30 minutes of like a 50-minute period. And then we spend the rest of the time like kind of looking at other types of databases and things they might use. If I don't have 30 minutes, I just do it with 1, and it takes 10 minutes. And I, we can kind of talk about if it were a different source, what might be other things you would look for. So it's sort of scalable to different time.
Great, thanks for expanding on that. And I'll just say I intend to have a stop here after Stephanie shares a little bit for some more questions, because I know when we get into the practical, for me at least, that's often when more questions arise. So I'll definitely want to pause there. But Stephanie, could you share from your activity experiences?
Sure. So this is from a class that I was able to meet with 4 or 5 times in the semester. So it's kind of between Rosemary's and Anne's example. It's not a credit course where I'm the primary instructor. It's not one shot. And this is a real luxury, I think, for librarians who aren't teaching full credit-bearing courses to have this much collaboration with the faculty. So this activity is a really close reading in class with a text that's assigned as one of the course readings. So this is something the students have already read for class, and they've already been thinking about it. They've written a 1-page response paper, and then we take most of the class period with the goal of identifying the theoretical framework from that article. So ultimately, they are compiling theory from different readings so that they can apply that to a new research question or a case for their final assignment. So we have the article that we're reading, and I have my example here, and I show them this is what reading looks like. Lots of underlines and circles and highlights and question marks and notes. So pointing out to them the physicality and that you're not just starting at the beginning and reading to the end. But we look for key points and main ideas, compare it with other texts, evaluate the rhetorical strategies, think about who's cited and why. So asking those questions right there together to try and get at what can we take from this article to understand that we could then apply to other readings and other cases.
So I'm going to hop in just real quickly because Hannah posted up the link to a little instrument that I use. This would work with anybody. It's the Metacognitive Awareness Reading Strategies Inventory. It's a list of about 30 some questions, I guess, or 31 prompts for particular reading practices. Like I always have a highlighter when I read, or I take frequent breaks when I read. I mean, just pretty fundamental stuff. And then the respondents can, I believe it's on a four item response. I do this. I never do this. I do it sometimes. I do it often. I do it all the time. And what that does, just by going through the inventory, is it gets the reader, it gets the student thinking about her or his practices, what she or he already does, and that boosts their confidence right away because they can say, oh yeah, this is on the list. I do this. I don't do this. So the other benefit of the inventory is that they get ideas about additional reading strategies. So it's a very simple instrument. It's open source. And thank you, Hannah, for giving us the link.
So there are a couple good links showing up in the chat. Some other folks have shared exercises that they do as well and some research, which is fantastic. But I do want to pause here and check if there are questions. The most recent one that I can see listed there is if anyone works on critical reading skills for non-native speakers. And I'm not sure in our current panelist mix if that's true, but I want to check and see if that's the case, or if folks on the chat have experiences with that as well.
So in the class that I've worked with the most, which is global studies, there are usually some non-native speakers. So it's not a concerted effort at working on this with that group, but I have had some experience. And what usually happens is that we do the activity I described as one of the early classes, and sometimes those students have come for one-on-one help. They kind of want to better understand or slow down the process that we did as the whole class and maybe think about that one-on-one. So just like that embedded approach, that also is a luxury to be able to spend that time. So it's maybe not a scalable approach to thinking about how this works with non-native speakers, but a little bit of experience just with slowing down and doing additional practice to sort of explain what we're trying to accomplish.
I'll also jump in and say I'm grateful for that question, because I'm thinking now I want to think about it more. But that one of the things that asking students what they'd like to pay attention to when they read, or what they think might be a good idea to look at, does is that students that can't read as quickly for whatever reason, they can still participate, they can still contribute, even if it's not based on what they're actually reading. So I'm not asking them to try to get through, a bunch of academic texts in a certain amount of time. I'm just asking them, okay, picture yourself doing this, what are you going to be doing? So I think that that can be one way to kind of equalize some of the differences.
And that's kind of what I would think Rosemary's metacognitive, well, you don't own it, Rosemary, but the Marzi inventory that you use would also facilitate that kind of reflection that could be used more broadly. Are there other questions in the chat that I mixed, or that kind of surfaced for folks? All right, I don't see any right now, but I am full of questions, never fear. So my next question is, we've talked a little bit about how, as librarians, sometimes, especially when given time pressure, we fall back on things like checklists or sort of fast fixes for things. So do you talk about the need to practice, to build up capacity as a reader, and any kind of strategy for doing that work?
So when we do that first activity, we have actually a handout, not a checklist, but a handout, suggesting to students that they might read a text at least 3 times, and some questions that they might ask at each point or at each reading. So that kind of communicates to them, again, this isn't just a start at the beginning, read to the end, but read through and look for these things, read it again and look for these things. And along with that, I think one of the things that's been most powerful from this experience for me, and I think the students, is in having the librarian do this work rather than the instructor. It kind of makes the point to them that we're all in this together. So it's very much me struggling through this social theory with them, not as an expert. And so they kind of come to understand in that way too, that it's not just a thing that you know how to do and you're able to do it, and some people can and some can't, that it's we're working on it, we're figuring it out, there's new things to discover and learn every time you read something. So I think that is a way of talking about that need for practice and for an iterative approach.
And just to insert a question that came up, Stephanie, are you willing to share that handout, which is not a checklist?
Sure.
Thanks.
I'll see if I can find it while we're here.
Yeah.
I'll just say real quickly that I forewarn students that reading always takes more time than they expect, and writing from the reading always takes more time than they expect. And I think the older the students are, or the further along they are in their academic careers, the more willing they are to hear that and to schedule, and to accommodate, the reality, I guess, of the time they need to give. We have in-class discussions just about the struggles with reading, actually. And I also have them do 3 or 4 journal reflections over the course of the semester. And in those reflections, and they have writing prompts. And in those, the students invariably will be able to reflect on how they are getting better at managing their time and at understanding how to reread, not just how to read the first time, but how to reread. So once again, that goes to shining a light on the what reading requires of us.
Yeah, I like that, and it reminds me of sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. So the first year student who's still mostly working off their high school understanding of reading. And so I see my work as just sort of reminding that the reading is a part of learning, and learning is supposed to be challenging. Like if it's easy for you, you probably aren't really like learning that much. You already actually know those things. And where I work, a lot of students are very smart, they're very bright, they're pretty well prepared, which is an unusual situation, but what it sort of reveals when they get in the classroom is that they are confused by situations in which something is difficult and will take practice. So I think just sort of resituating reading as a kind of learning, which is essentially what Rosemary's saying as well, is a step that, you know, they can't take overnight, but they can take over the course of a semester.
I think there's a chat question that I think both and your response and Rosemary, I'd welcome your insights too, but getting at this idea that there's different ways that you need to read at different times, and especially thinking about grad students, that they have to do things for coursework, they need to do things for comps. Do you, I'll give you a chance to read that one if you haven't yet from Mandy, but do you have a response to her question?
I can go first. The course I teach is for graduate students in our music conservatory. So they are reading across a bunch of different genres, and they're reading for different purposes throughout their programs. So unlike students in the natural and the biological and the social sciences who are reading essentially the same format most of the time, you know, we all know what a research study in the sciences, for example, looks like. With the music students, their readings are, they read philosophy, they read theory, they read analysis, they read musicology, they read history, they read all kinds of genres. And so we talk about that, those differences, and we also discuss the reading with purpose. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. And once students understand that the purpose for reading changes with the reading and with the intent and with the goal, they're able to handle it better. And just at a basic level, I'll go back to the Marcy. I'll go back to the inventory, and we go through a few of those skills or those practices and say, well, maybe this would work better for when you're trying to get ready for your comprehensive exams. Maybe this would work better when you're trying to write a paper for your theory class.
And I'll just insert here too to open it up to Stephanie and Anne as well, and not just sort of the graduate end of things, but Rosemary is talking about different disciplinary based reading skills. So as librarians, we're not often experts in a particular discipline. Sometimes we are, but not all the time, or we serve so many varied folks that even if we have an expertise, it's not in all the things. So do you discuss discipline-based reading practices with your learners, or do you feel that that's something in your position as a librarian that you are able to do in an effective way?
I have started doing that even with first-year students, because many of them have assignment. And when I say I have started doing that, I mean talking about disciplinary differences. Because even as first-year students, many of them have research assignments in which they're going to be looking at scholarly literature, and I can't really provide them sort of one way of doing that because they might be looking at lots of different kinds of things. So I'm kind of at the beginning of thinking about that. To me, what has been most helpful in the sort of one-shot teaching situation is to ask the instructor, if they're there, to talk about how they read. And this is kind of going back to the question from Mandy, but I often will have professors say just sort of very explicitly to students, like, well, you don't have to read that whole book, you know, just like read the chapter that you want. And then we can talk about like, well, when is that appropriate? When would you do that versus when would you read the book? What are you missing by not reading the old book? And so that, I think it helps them to hear from their instructors that you do have to make these pragmatic decisions about amount of content. Because I can tell them that, but they need to know it from the person who's going to evaluate them. So that's kind of two parts of that answer.
So I'll say that one of the things that got me really interested in critical reading early on was a book it's called Critical Reading in Higher Education, Academic Goals and Social Engagement. And it's included in our reading list. So if you haven't checked out the reading list on the ACRL instruction section website, it's listed there, and Anne-Marie will probably link to it as well. But it talks about disciplinary perspectives on critical reading, and that it is different and that it matters for those perspectives as well. So that would be a great resource to follow up on. I do want to come back to the question that MH asked in the chat panel, because it's a great prompt, and you have been talking about how you work with different people already, but her question, or the question is, how did you convince other librarians, faculty, administration, etc., that critical reading is something that librarians should teach as well? So kind of getting at this partnerships idea.
So in my case, the first partnership was initiated by the faculty member, but the way she approached it sort of gave me my future ammunition to reach others with it. She came to me with a problem. She said, my students can't understand what they're reading enough to be able to apply theory to a case in the world. It's not working. What I'm doing isn't working. Can you help? And so we sort of figured out, we worked backwards from what she wanted them to be able to do. They're not getting it on their own or with what she was already doing. What do we need to build forward to get them to that point? And that meant making the final assignment much smaller, really slowing things down. So that was the initial one, but what it meant then, when we talked about this with others, is that we could say, what's the problem with research or reading that your students are having? What are you noticing when you read their final papers or whatever? And is there something we can do to address that? So rather than saying, here's a thing I can do for you, what is it that you need, period, and then kind of figure out together, how can we address that? And we did some faculty development workshops based on the original project, and then there were some really great subsequent ones. So we've done the workshop a few times, and new faculty come and sort of see how the collaboration with the library has helped with these really knotty problems. And so it inspires others to kind of try new things and want to look to us not just as a service, but as experts in teaching and learning.
I'll sort of complement that experience by saying that I just kind of started doing it because I thought it was necessary. And then I saw that the instructors were responding well to it. I think that in my case, with the kinds of classes I was working with, I don't think they would have ever said that to me as a need, like, I would like for you to be doing this with my students. But I just was like, let's do this and let's see what students do when they talk about reading. And they all kind of liked it. And honestly, I think they just found it less boring also when we did one-shots and they were in the class and we were talking about reading. The professors were also more interested. So I think there was some sort of just kind of like, oh, this is better than like watching you with the database yet again. But part of it was really just sort of trying it, and then I didn't need to convince them because then they had sort of seen the benefit of it before considering whether they wanted it. So that was a little backwards, but that was the way I approached it.
I can add that because I'm on a small campus, I'm often aware of new working groups or committees that form. And so I've been part of our Writing in the Disciplines faculty-wide committee for some years now, and from the very beginning, I really preached reading, that we cannot unpack reading and writing. So I've got them convinced. And out of that, I'm really sort of envious with Lynn Harrison. In her comment, she says that they have elected closed critical reading for enhanced writing for their QEP project. That is absolutely wonderful. Our writing in the Disciplines Committee put that forth as a proposal among several other proposals for our QEP, and it wasn't edgy enough. So my approach is usually one faculty at a time, one person at a time. Yep.
I really appreciate the recognition that this is a structural issue. It's much more than a simple phonetic, for example, which is not what we've talked at all about with reading, but it's not a tips or tricks kind of approach. It's backing up and seeing what about the assignment has made a focus on reading be what it is or isn't. What can we change to scaffold this, as Stephanie was noting, to spend more time on reading and reward reading then in a way that students can recognize and start to build up that practice. So I want to ask, I know each of you do some research as well as teaching. So if you could describe how critical reading work overlaps with your praxis. And Anne-Marie's been busy posting links to some of Rosemary's work, so I know this is very relevant for her. But if you could tell us about any research that you've done that deals with aspects of critical reading.
Should I start? Okay. This is actually something that was a result of my doctoral research. I was looking at the experience of literature reviewing soup to nuts among doctoral students. And I interviewed a bunch of them. I interviewed doctoral students. And at the time I was thinking, the literature review, well, it's finding stuff and writing about it. But reading for the doctorate just absolutely bubbled to the surface, much to my surprise. And I saw, I think, a gap in our instruction that's important for all of us. So I've followed that thread. I followed that thread for the last couple of years. I work with and I collect data. I collect narrative data from grad students. I've made several presentations, and one thing that I might recommend to others is, regardless of whether you're doing, big research or stepping into it, or, for the first time, look at the literature and the scholarship of teaching and learning, because I have found that the folks who are involved in SOTL are very receptive, very, very receptive to research that comes from teaching and teaching that's informed by research. So that would be my recommendation.
So the social change part of this, for me, is in how it connects with critical theory. So we're empowering students to direct their own learning and growth versus just dumping information on them. So that's a research and practice interest of mine. I'm also interested in perceptions and outcomes of library support for curricular initiatives. So our library was also involved with the Quality Enhancement Plan for SACS accreditation in our case. Our objective was inquiry. That was the one that we really helped with. So I'm interested in how do those kinds of curricular changes work when the library is involved? And what's the perception of that involvement on campus from faculty, from administrators? So that's something that I'm interested in. And then also just teaching and learning practices generally, scaffolded learning, active learning. How does critical reading fit into those approaches?
So, Anne, I don't know if you want to speak to this, but I'm going to segue for you to jump back in with that one if you want. And I see a couple questions in the chat. I'll get to those after this question. But Stephanie, you brought up that idea of the social aspect of critical reading. And so not just looking at the reading part of this, but critical reading. How does the reading that we're trying to teach folks to do impact themselves, impact the world? Do you bring that up, or do you feel that that is something that you're working towards in your instruction?
So depending on the audience, I sometimes make this explicit and sometimes not. So I think we want students to read this way so they can question assumptions, so they can challenge binary thinking, and so they can tolerate ambiguity. So I think all of those are necessary conditions if we're going to change the world. So like I said, certainly when we talk about this approach with other faculty and faculty development workshops, we talk about that. And sometimes with the students, because what's interesting about this, with having this kind of philosophy of doing things this way, is that it's been surprising how resistant students often are, that they want to just be shown a database or be lectured to. And when we're really asking for them to engage with us and with the text, it's not just, oh, isn't this a wonderful thing you're trying to do for me? It's why do we have to do this? And so we kind of talk about it, that we recognize that in many cases, education they've gotten to this point has been very different from this. So we're asking them to do something new, different, maybe scary, but that it's with the idea that then they would be able to kind of figure out what questions they want to ask and where their place is in these conversations.
Hannah, would you just repeat that question again? I was so entranced listening to Stephanie, and then I was like, oh, wait, what am I responding to?
It was a long wander of a question. So looking at the critical part of reading, thinking about reading for change, either in the student themselves or in the world.
Well, I would say, in working with first-year students, I think, yeah, I agree with Stephanie that part of it is just sort of what do they think their education is for? They've come into college with certain ideas about why they're there, and they also have come in with certain ideas about sort of who does their education, like who really is in charge of that. And usually it's not them, it's somebody else, it's the teacher, or it's their parents or something like that. And so I think sort of in some ways, critical reading can be an opening into thinking about the purpose of their education. If you can choose how you read and what you read, and how you would evaluate a particular reading and whether you think it's sound or not, there's other things that you can choose as well. I mean, there are some things you can't choose, like you don't get to choose a lot of your course reading. So this is sort of balanced by what they perceive as a lack of choice in many ways. But there are a lot of things now that they have some agency in, and I think many of our students don't necessarily see themselves as people with agency in certain ways. And so I think reading can be an opening into that conversation.
One of the things that I find really difficult to combat is the me and us, or the me and them, us and them. I think maybe Anne spoke to that just a little bit a while ago. And so I talked to students about the difference between criticizing and critiquing, because they are asked to do that, and they're asked to read critically. And actually to criticize a reading, to respond in a criticizing way is actually very, very easy. But I try to get the point across by saying that criticism comes from here. It comes from the inside, the heart, the emotions, the fire, if you will. And critique comes from here. It comes from the intellect. So I try to get them to think about critiquing rather than criticizing. Another thing that comes to mind about how critical reading can affect social change, well, one person at a time. But I think that being able to read critically leads to self-empowerment. It can lead to greater confidence. We're in a time of, let's say, misleading information is absolutely rampant. And if you're not able to make your way through that jungle, you're going to have difficulty. You have to be able to read critically to get along in the world. That's really, that comes from a pretty personal place, but I think perhaps it will resonate with some of you. Text is everywhere. It's on our iPads, it's on our laptops, text is everywhere. It's out in the world, and I can't really see text going away entirely. So we have to be able to receive it, interpret it, critique it, understand it, and then work with it. And I think the better that we are able to do that for ourselves and within our own communities, wherever they may be, we are strengthening at least our connections with other people or those who are within our limited spheres of influence.
Thanks. So I'm going to do a little bit of a hard shift back to the more learning and processing end of reading and get to Dale's question. So I don't know if you had a chance to see it, and Mandy gave a great response as well, and I think we just got another one. But if there are tools that you recommend for processing and working with the texts that you recommend for students.
Well, I'll just say that this has been something that's been intimidating to me because I already feel like there's so many hurdles to engaging in critical reading. And so because I'm working with first-year students and I'm thinking about them as people that are being asked to do many, many new things already, I have not really worked with digital tools, to just be straight up about the answer. And I've actually asked them to just have notes about their reading. So just the act of taking notes is already more than they were probably going to do anyway. And so for me, I haven't sort of ventured into the digital realm just by having to make sort of a trade-off of where do I want to put their attention. I mean, I know of some, but I can't speak of them out of experience.
So I'll address Dale's question from my own personal experience a little bit. So I also work with graduate students quite a bit, and I teach Zotero on our campus. And I've taught Zotero for so long that, I need to make changes in part to make my life interesting. So one thing I have focused on more recently is modeling how I take notes. And I tell students that is by no means the only way to take notes, but I want to show them a range of strategies so that they can develop their own approach. And so I show different ways of highlighting, different ways that I signal to myself when the notes I've taken are in my own voice as opposed to a quote. And for myself, I do that with color coding. I show tags as a way of showing works in process. And so I model it so they know the tool is there, but I also model it as a way to signal these are engaged with the text. You might engage with text depending on your discipline in this way. Maybe there's other ways that you can think of, but I've tried to focus more on modeling that. And there's some great ideas popping up in the chat list as well, and good things to expand to our resource list as well. Are there other thoughts about the note-taking tools that our panelists wanted to share? All right, so a good question there. So will the chat transcript be sent out? Patrick is nodding his head, so yes, that will be part of what we can capture. I'm not actually sure if it's captured jointly with the recording, but we can capture the chat transcript. So we're getting close to the end, and if you have more questions, definitely put them in the list. But my last question is, if you had to choose just one strategy, or maybe it's a piece of advice to help learners begin to read more critically, what would that be?
Well, mine would be it's sort of advice with an action item, to recognize yourself as a reader. And the way to do that would be to make a list of what you do when you read right now. Like, what do you already do when you read? It's a variation of, sort of the metacognitive piece. And then sort of see critical reading strategies not as like what you already do is wrong or you need to get rid of all of that, but these are things you can add. Like, you have a good starting place, and now where can you go from here? So making a list of steps you take when you read would be my advice.
And I agree wholeheartedly. I think that the first step really is for students to recognize the importance of reading. That's why we're shining a light on it. And also to see themselves as readers, to understand themselves as readers, to interrogate themselves as readers.
So my one tip or piece of advice would be to librarians and faculty rather than to students. So I think in order to make this work, we have to slow it down and make it smaller. So try and do more with less, or less with more. I think more with less is what I mean. So maybe if your goal is to have students be able to read critically, you shouldn't be assigning a 15-page research paper at the end of the semester and not talking to them about it in the meantime. But if you can break that into smaller pieces that really target the goals you actually have for the students, whether you're the faculty member or you're the librarian doing one-shot or embedded or a credit course, to think about what you're doing. Is it accomplishing the goal? Is there a way that you can really make it more deliberate, more about process than product, and slow it down and make it smaller to focus on what the students really need to learn and practice?
So I'll choose, I think we have time for this one last question that showed up in the panel. So the great instruction librarians in the crowd asking, do you assess the effectiveness of these critical reading activities?
I'll just say briefly, for the activity that I described with the sort of reading the same article very briefly and talking about strategies, I don't do this in every class, but sort of periodically to check in about it, what I do is just have them vote a second time. And I sort of see if their votes change on the quality of the piece. To me, that indicates that they've been listening to their peers and thinking about more deeply about how they might evaluate the quality of the article, or already kind of making some decisions about maybe it's not as good as I thought. So it's not complete. It doesn't assess what they've reflected on, but it does kind of assess like what they've sort of heard about the piece from their peers.
So with the classes where we're focusing on critical reading or using some of these strategies, we have been able to look at annotated bibliographies from students. So we're looking at the kinds of sources that they're choosing, how they're annotating them, and it sort of gets at my idea that if we teach them to read these sources, they'll be choosing and using better ones. So we're kind of looking at how that works. We're focusing on reading, but then we're looking at the sources that they then choose to build their own research question.
And I guess the primary way that I look at, or I try to evaluate whether their reading skills are changing, is I see their writing. I see that not only are they writing, I'll take the literature review as an example. They're writing from the literature, but they're also writing about the literature. And you have to be able to read more deeply in order to write about the literature, or to talk about it or to give a presentation, and which, all come in there too. Some way of expressing publicly, because reading is done in private. That's why we don't pay attention to it sometimes, perhaps, until we see a public manifestation of it. And that's a presentation or, as I said, something in writing or even a conversation. So, sure.
So we are out of time, and that was a great finish. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all of the participants, both for being great listeners, but also those who shared links. And there's an evaluation form reminder that's showing up there in the chat. So please take a chance to do that. There were requests for some more resources. So hopefully we get that. Patrick, do you have any last words or business to take care of?
Hey, so just to say thank you so much to you, Hannah, and to Anne-Marie for moderating this really excellent panel, and to our panelists, Rosemary, Stephanie, and Anne, and also to everybody for asking wonderful questions and contributing your own experience. So our committee member, Alyssa, has resent the link to the evaluation, so please do fill that out, because it will help us to continue to plan these things in the future. And other than that, thank you so much for joining us today. Bye-bye, everybody.